Well, let's start by my attempting to tell you a little bit about the polymath, person versed in many different disciplines and so forth. George was born, I will use, now that I've used French, I'll use the English probably thereafter. I mainly knew him as George, which he tolerated. Were you born in Switzerland?
Oh,
I know you grew up
raised, born
in the French area of Switzerland, so his native language, his first language is French. Is your second first language English?
My second language is Tibetan.
First language.
Tibetan.
Second first language is Tibetan.
Yeah.
The third first language is English, and then there's some Italian.
Yeah, that's just
a little bit
nothing.
of German and so forth. I remember his telling me that. I hope I'm not revealing that when he came to India, which was after what we call here high school.
Yeah.
And at some point he saw some Tibetans debating, and he thought, I'd like to do that. And what year was that?
What's that?
What year was that?
1970, 79.
Did we somehow miss each other in 72, or is that when we started?
No, that's not.
So my first trip to India was in 72, at which time George was at the School of Dialectics, and our relationship started there.
Mm-hmm.
And it went through very, what do you say? At some points we would discuss issues so loudly that people would think we were fighting. Not just arguing even, but actually fighting. I remember one of the Dalai brothers coming on the very small veranda there was on the building, and coming out to the window to come in and separate us, because he thought we were at each other's throats. But we weren't at all. We were having, it was always, always vigorous discussions, interesting discussions, and sometimes very vigorous. He's a person of wide-ranging interests. Philosophy, epistemology, is the kind of person who at least used to read some science magazines. Do you still?
A little bit.
And an intellect that absorbs a tremendous amount of material. He's the person who taught me that once you get the idea of something, you don't need to read it anymore. Which I also apply to the news.
But there you can't go wrong.
And our relationship has been very, very fruitful over now 23 years.
Something like that.
24.
A few years.
And currently he's teaching at Williams in Massachusetts, and has just recently, a few months ago, accepted a position at the University of Washington. So one anticipates the flowering of Tibetan studies again at the University of Washington. When I was in Seattle this summer, people knew he was coming, and we're making preparations. So we welcome you back to the University of Virginia with great glee.
Thank you. This is quite an introduction, so I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do after that. I'm obviously very happy to be back. Hasn't changed very much, actually. Okay. So, you asked me to talk about Yogacara.
Yes.
And this is not something about which I have very much to say. So, what I thought I would do today is talk a little bit about the importance of Yogacara in the Tibetan tradition. And just throw out a few ideas, just sketch out things very roughly, then talk briefly about some of Shakya Chokden's idea, and then open the floor for you to discuss, to ask questions, and talk in greater detail about what you would like to talk more about. Now, in approaching Yogacara, there are a number of ways to proceed, obviously. One way, for example, is to talk about Yogacara doxographically. There is a particular school of thought, school of tenet, and so on. One way, obviously, would be to abord Yogacara from the Indian side through the text, hopefully some Sanskrit text and so on. That's one way to proceed. The other way is what I just explained, the kind of doxographical approach, which looks at Yogacara as a school of thought, which then is related to other school of thought as is depicted as somewhat inferior to what we all know to be the truth, Madhyamika, and so on. So that's this approach, which I'm caricaturing actually, but which has its validity and also its limitation. Now, I think there are other ways to understand Yogacara, and what I would like to talk about today is not so much Yogacara per se, but the place of Yogacara in the Tibetan tradition, and why is it an important school, tradition, and so on, in a way which the doxographical approach doesn't capture. Because in the doxographical approach, Yogacara is below, and so you wonder, well, why bother, right? And as I think I can show, it's a very important school, and it clearly is at the center of a very important distinction in Tibetan Buddhism. So that's what I want to talk about. And then if you want to talk more about Yogacara, we can go on to that. Now, to understand the place of Yogacara, we have to relate Yogacara to its scriptural background, which is, as you all know, the third turning of the wheel. So we have the three turnings of the wheel. This is all familiar, right? Now, in talking about the second and the third turning of the wheel, here I want to use the word third turning of the wheel in a broader sense, not just the Sandhya Sutra, but including a number of sutras which are not completely identical, but which have related themes, such as, for example, all the different Tathagata sutras, the Mahaparinirvana Sutra, and all that. All these sutras can be grouped as belonging to the third turning of the wheel. And it's this group of scripture, including the Sandhya Sutra, but also Tathagata Sutra, and all these sutra. It is this group of sutra which is very important, because Tibetan schools understand these sutras quite differently, and this difference, I think, is an important one in Tibetan Buddhism. Now, let me emphasize that these sutras are not necessarily identical. The Sandhya and, for example, the Sandhya is clearly a Yogacara Sutra. It could even be a Chittamatra Sutra. As you will see, I will draw a distinction between mind only and Yogacara with Shakya Chokden. But it's also clear that this sutra is different from the Tathagata Sutra. So I'm not saying that they have necessarily the same message or the same doctrine, but they can be grouped together. And this grouping together then contrasts, if you want, two very broad approach that you find in the Tibetan tradition and in Indian scriptural background, which is the second turning of the wheel, putting the emphasis on emptiness understood as what you call non-implicative negation or non-affirmative negation. But is emptiness understood as a mere lack of svabhava, self-being, something like that. So that's the second turning of the wheel, the Prajnaparamita Sutras. And the third turning of the wheel, presenting ultimate reality differently, presenting ultimate reality in relation to the mind. Now, I leave it purposefully vague because these sutras actually have different views of what that ultimate reality is, and they spell it out slightly differently, but they all agree in emphasizing a view of reality in which mind is central. So this, you could say, to use Tibetan category, that this is a view of ultimate reality, not as a non-implicative or non-affirming negation, but as an implicative negation, right? And what is implied here is the mind. Put it very, very vaguely, because actually how the mind is explained by the different sutras, different tradition is slightly different, but all these sutras agree in presenting ultimate reality as somehow involving the mind. Hence, my calling them, and Tibetan scholars call them, often speak of its emptiness, of its ultimate reality as being an implicative, right, or an affirming negation, rather than the non-affirming negation or the non-implicative negation of the second turning of the wheel. Now, we have these two different approaches to understanding ultimate reality, and I would like to claim that these two different approaches determine two different groups of thinkers within the Tibetan tradition. Those who rely on the second turning of the wheel, and those who rely on the second, but mostly on the third. And this is a very important distinction, which does not, let me emphasize that, recover the distinction of school. For example, the Gelugpa obviously fall in the first approach of taking the second turning of the wheel as central, right? Then the third turning of the wheel is basically explained in relation to this second turning. So it's clear that for the Gelugpa, this is central. But there are other people as well. For example, Shakya Pandita is a very good example of a thinker who holds that the view of reality is expressed fully by the second turning of the wheel. And the third turning of the wheel doesn't really bring anything new. And when Shakya Pandita talks about Tantra, he presents basically the same view as Tsongkhapa, that is, Tantra is a special type of method which use and enhance the kind of wisdom which is developed in relation to the second turning of the wheel. So it's important to emphasize that when I differentiate these two groups, I'm not talking about Gelugpa versus non-Gelugpa, but I am talking about two groups of thinkers, one side the Gelugpa plus a certain number of other figures. I by far don't know all of them, but Shakya Pandita is a very good example. And then the second group of thinkers, in which you find obviously Nyingma and many Kagyus and so on, maybe some Shakya as well. Certainly Shakya Choden, but Shakya Choden is not by far not a typical Shakya. So in that second group of thinkers, you have thinkers who hold also the proponent of Zhentong, obviously the Jonangpa and so on. All these thinkers who disagree among themselves still can share this, that is, they share the view that ultimate reality should be understood not just according to the second turning of the wheel, but according to the third turning of the wheel. And that's a very important distinction within Tibetan Buddhism. As you probably know, the distinctions within Tibetan Buddhism are actually extremely small and minute. If you compare Indian and Tibetan Buddhism, it's amazing. I mean, Tibetan always seem to agree on most of them, on most of their view and practices. So we are talking about small differences, but still there are differences, and I think this is a fairly crucial difference, whether a particular school holds to the second or the third turning of the wheel as providing the view of ultimate reality. This is masked by the use of the terms such as prasangika. This is absolutely masked. Now, the reason this is masked is that in Tibet, because prasangika became so famous, most of the people, most of the thinkers nowadays, for example, a person like Mipham will say, yes, I am a prasangika. But actually, if you look at Mipham's text, you can see that Mipham actually doesn't really favor a kind of Chandrakirti approach, and his approach is slightly different. And in fact, it's different because in order for him to put his view of ultimate reality, he would tend to rely more on the third turning of the wheel than on the second. So the use of doxographical categories is actually here hiding that difference, because prasangika being so famous, everybody is going to say, yeah, we are prasangika. You're obviously all aware that prasangika is a complete Tibetan creation, which has practically no basis. I'm obviously provocative here, but practically no basis in Indian tradition. And it's very important to understand that this is a distinction, Svatantrika Prasangika, which is part of a hermeneutical scheme meant to understand and appropriate the teaching of emptiness. So it's very important to understand that these schemes, which have some, I'm not saying they have no validity. The point is not that they have no validity. The point is that they are hermeneutical schemes, but they are not just capturing like eternal side in Buddhist tradition, but they are meant to create order and allow a certain appropriation of the tradition. So this distinction between second and third turning of the will is not well brought out by doxographical categories, because most of the thinkers belonging to the second group are still going to claim that they are prasangika and so on. And this is because prasangika became such a famous, I mean, it's a kind of loaded term. If you're not a prasangika, you kind of have the inferior view and so on. Okay, this distinction being made, you may wonder now, what's the place of Yogācāra in the whole story? Well, the place of Yogācāra is very easy. It's that the thinkers who favor the second approach are going to make a distinction between Yogācāra and Chittamatra, and going to use Yogācāra in one way or another to put forth their view of reality. Not that they are necessarily going to identify themselves as Yogācāra, but they are going to use that idea in order to put forth their view of reality. And this is why Yogācāra cannot be understood in the Tibetan tradition just in doxographical terms, but has to be understood in relation to what have to be understood. Doxography are actually categories which are part of larger interpretive schemes, right? So in order to understand what these people do with terms like Yogācāra and Chittamatra, you have to understand where they take their stance, right? And this is where Yogācāra comes in. Let me illustrate this with the example of Shakya Choden. Shakya Choden is theoretically a Shakya. Actually, he's a very bad example of the Shakya, since he's profoundly disliked by most Shakyas. He's, in my mind, one of the most interesting Tibetan thinkers. His works is often divided, there is a great deal of argument about that, but in three periods. An early period in which Shakya Choden was a fairly classical Madhyamika, then a period of transition, which is sometimes described as a Yogācāra period, but I think this is not exactly I mean, it's a slightly loaded term, but we could describe it as a kind of Yogācāra period. And then the third period which is Zhentong, Great Madhyamika period. The conversion of Shakya Choden to Zhentong, to the view of other-emptiness, the Great Madhyamika. I'm going to use the word Great Madhyamika here as meaning the view of Zhentong, right? Of other-emptiness or other-voidness, right? You're all familiar, presumably. I mean, you all have heard this term, right? Zhentong. So this is what I mean by Great Madhyamika. So Shakya Choden conversion to Great Madhyamika happened towards the end of his life. It's not sure why. The seventh Karmapa, Shakya Gyatso, was probably quite influential in that. He was himself a Zhentong. But it is also clear that when you look at Shakya Choden's work, there is an evolution from his early work to his later works. And you see, for example, in the works of the middle period, for example, the Zuma Namnge, which is the gigantic 2-volume work on Madhyamika, you see some ideas of yoga of Zhentong creeping in. And it's interesting the way they creep in, because they creep in as they are presented as Yogācāra. Throughout the 3 periods of his life, and most Parampa does the same, and I think many non-Gelug thinkers do the same distinction. Shakya Choden draws a distinction between Chittamatra and Yogācāra. Chittamatra is, let's say, roughly what probably you have talked about in this seminar. That is, if we take the teaching of the 3 natures, Parakalpita, the imaginary, is unreal. On that, everybody agrees. Parinispana, the fully established, is real. On this, everybody agrees. Then the discussion is, what is the status of Paratantra? Now, Shakya Choden has many different explanations, and he changes, and I have not kept track of the detail, but if you want to very roughly simplify, the view holding that Paratantra, the dependent nature, is real would be Chittamatra, right? The view holding that Paratantra is unreal would be Yogācāra. Now, what's the difference between Paratantra and Parinispana? It's basically a difference between ordinary and pure mind. Parinispana is something like mind seen without duality. Paratantra is dualistic mind, right? So it's clear that for one more thing to say is that for a person like Shakya Choden, but almost everybody like Kuramba, Mipham, and so on, there is a difference from Tsongkhapa, that is here in Gelugpa. Usually we'd say that everything is of the nature of the mind, therefore the table is of the nature of the mind, but the table exists, right? This is not Kuramba or Shakya Choden view. For them, the table does not exist. It's mind only, meaning it's not there, right? If there was a table, it would be made of matter, and matter cannot exist as having the nature of mind. Therefore, it's not made of matter. Therefore, there is no table. Now, what is Paratantra is a perception of the table. It's not the table, it's a perception of the table. Now, what the dispute, or what the 2 views are, is one view is that the perception of the table is real, the other view is that it's not real. And how does it go? Well, the perception of the table is a dualistic perception, hence it's impure, hence and so on, therefore it's not real. This is the Yogācāra view. The Chittamatra view would be that it is real. Right? So here is a crucial distinction between Chittamatra and Yogācāra, which is made by most of these thinkers, and which help them to push forth a view of reality which is more based on the 3rd turning of the wheel than on the 2nd turning of the wheel. And this is why this is an important issue for these thinkers. This difference between Chittamatra and Yogācāra, when you take it within the context of Pramana studies of Buddhist logic and epistemology, is often cast as a difference between what I call true expectarians and false expectarians, right? Namdempa and Namdzumpa. The topic of dispute between these two views, let's say, is the notion of akara, right? That is nampa, the aspect. The Buddhist view the Pramana view of mind is that mind doesn't grasp external objects, but only holds representation of external objects. And this representation are called akara, right? That is nampa aspect, right? And they are representations, they are kind of internal objects, internal to the mind. Now, the Sautrantika view is that these internal representations are caused by external objects, right? The Chittamatra view is that these internal representations are not caused by external objects, they are caused by inner vasana, right? Propensities or potentialities. And then they come to fruition, and then a perception occurs, right? Now, when that perception occurs, the representation is just caused by the propensities, not caused by an external object. Yet the akara, the aspect, the representation, and the mind, representation being created in the field of the mind, this representation is held by the Chittamatra view to be real, right? So that's a Chittamatra view, that's the Namdempa, the true expectarian view, right? It's true expectarian because it holds that the object is true, is real. The false expectarian, and here it's Yogācāra view, is that this akara, this aspect, this nampa, is not real, it's false. It's it's completely deceptive, and therefore is just a kind of covering up of what really is real, which is the pure mind. It has no real reality. Now, this actually gets really complicated because there are a number of distinctions which I have completely lost track about the different degrees of reality that you can impute to the Paratantra or to the akara, but basically, to simplify very roughly, I think that's not a false picture. So for the false expectarian, what's real is just the mind in its purity, right? Pure mind. And that's what's parinispana, and that's real, right? And that's what people like Shakya Choden and Korampa, and I believe Mipham, think hold Yogācāra to mean, right? And for them it's quite important because, as I said earlier, it's quite close to the kind of view that they want to really come to, which is a view of ultimate reality based on the third turning of the wheel, right? Because they understand this view. Why do they think that the third turning of the wheel is so important? Because they think it provides the view of ultimate reality in which Tantra, or through which Tantra makes much more sense. If you take the Prajnaparamita Sutra view and bring it to Tantra, it's kind of, practically it works, but philosophically, it really does not account for what's going on in Tantric texts. In Tantric texts, they always talk about ultimate reality as being not just mere absence, but being also the mind of clear light, right? For example. So when you look, practically, if you have the second turning of view based on the second turning of the view and practice Tantra, no problem. Philosophically, you're going to have a gap between Sutra and Tantra, which is indeed what you find in Tsongkhapa, in Sakya Pandita, and so on, where the philosophy is based on the second turning of the wheel, and then the practice is based on the Tantra, but the two really don't quite fit together, though pragmatically it works fine. It's just philosophically. it's a bit more problematic. When you take the third turning of the wheel, a text, for example, another text, which is not canonical in the narrow sense, but is Vayuttara Tantra, right? When you take that kind of text and you base your view of reality on that kind of text, then you have a view of reality which is already based on mind, right? And when you move from that to Tantra, you're basically refining the view of mind which is in Vayuttara Tantra, but you're not changing very much. Here you have already in Vayuttara Tantra a view of mind, a view of the ultimate reality, which is very germane to the tantric way of looking at the two truths, right? So this is why this second group of thinkers hold this so important. And so in order to kind of prepare that, they separate the notion of Chittamatra and Yogācāra, so that Yogācāra becomes either the ultimate view itself, or at least close to the ultimate view. And this is, for example, what you can see in Shakya Choden. In the early period, Yogācāra, you have still a clear gradation, Chittamatra, Yogācāra, and then Madhyamika. And then in the middle period, he starts to change. You have Chittamatra, and then you have two Madhyamika. You have Madhyamika according to the Nagarjuna, based on logical reasoning and so on, Madhyamika of analysis. And then you have the Madhyamika of experience, which you find in the text of Maitreya. And that Madhyamika of experience is also called, is Yogācāra. Now at that point in the middle period, Shakya Choden thinks that still it's not quite the ultimate view, but maybe it's really close, maybe there is not much difference between the two, they come down to the same. I mean, you can sense a certain ambiguity because the reason it's probably so ambiguous is that Shakya was absolutely adamantly opposed to any idea like that, right? He's, as you know, in his Donsum Rabye, Shakya Pandita attacked very violently Dzogchen, or mostly Mahamudra, but also Dzogchen. All the views, in fact, which take the third turning of the wheel as their main basis, right? So, for this reason, presumably Shakya Choden felt quite shy of expressing his interest for what he called the Madhyamika based on experience, which is the view found in the Maitreya text. But in his third period, when he goes quite boldly and say, well, this is the great Madhyamika view. And at that point, he identified Yogācāra and great Madhyamika. And the view here is, as you know, is the Zhentong view of mind is real, everything else is unreal, conventional truth is unreal, ultimate truth is real. What is ultimate truth? Well, it is pure mind, right? Though, in fact, maybe I will conclude on that, it's important when you see the label Zhentong to realize that there are, under this label, a number of different views fit in. And Shakya Choden view and Dolpopa's view are not the same. Similarly,
yeah, I was just going to ask you.
Yeah, we can talk about that. They're not the same. They are different. Then you have even more moderate view of Zhentong, which call themselves Zhentong, but which are quite far from Dolpopa. So if you want, I can talk more about that. But there is a vast array of views which are called themselves Zhentong, but which are different.
Yes, so they mark.
Well, one of the difference, for example, between, I forgot, there is a small text by Taranatha. Taranatha was a Jonampa, as you know. So his view is very much the orthodox Jonampa view, which you find in Dolpopa. In Taranatha is a small text called Nyerchik, in which he lists 21 differences between Dolpopa and Shakya Choden. And one of the key issues, okay, if you say, well, what does it mean for somebody to be a Zhentongpa? That's a difficult question. What I just said, ultimate is real, conventional is unreal is a very, very simplified view. For example, in some of his texts, Mipham flirts with the Zhentong view. Now, if you ask nowadays Nyingma, they will say, no, he wasn't serious. He was just writing for some people. I don't know. It's clear that one of the key issues between Zhentong and the other is the third turning of the wheel talks about the pure mind, right? In the Dolpopa, in the Dreyfus view, that pure mind is seen as fully real. Now, that's what I would call an extreme Zhentong view. Shakya Choden also holds, in his third period, also holds that the mind to be real, but he makes an interesting difference. He says there are two ways of looking at this pure mind. One is from the point of view of experience, and it is real. The other is from the point of view of logical investigation, and at that point it is not real because nothing is found in ultimate analysis. So Shakya Choden already, as you can see, has a view of Zhentong which kind of pulls away from this Dolpopa, what I call the extreme Zhentong view, and kind of hedges back, right? It is real experientially, it's unreal from the point of view of Madhyamika analysis, right? Then when you go to people like Mipham and so on, there is very little talk of the pure mind being real. One of the issues, nevertheless, which remains and which could identify them as having some sympathy with Zhentong is a discussion of the nature of the pure mind. For example, Mipham is very insistent that the pure mind is not impermanent. It's not produced by cause and condition. It's not a compounded phenomenon. It is an uncompounded phenomena. It is permanent. Why is it? Well, if it were compounded by cause and condition, it could not be ultimate truth, right? So this is probably an issue which is also fairly close to what Zhentong is. And, well, now the question is there a tension between this and the traditional Madhyamika approach? That's obviously an interesting and important question, but people like Mipham, for example, would argue that there is no tension. They would say, yes, the pure mind is permanent, but it doesn't make it real, right? It's as unreal as anything else. And, but it's still not impermanent. So this is one of the issues.
But not real.
No, not real. Now, otherwise you have a Zhentong view which contradicts the second turning of the wheel, right? Whereas Mipham is very careful, as a fairly recent contemporary Nyingma, not to contradict the view which is so dominant in Tibet by the 17th, 18th century, right? So given that kind of climate, it's very difficult for somebody to come up and say, yeah, we really think it's real. And by the way, Chandrakirti was just a jerk. Right? This is a little difficult. So you find all these strategies to trying to kind of mediate or get a position which is still Zhentong but more moderate and so on. In most of his writing, let me be clear, Mipham is not a Zhentong, but he has some Zhentong writing. And he does repeatedly argue for the fact that the pure mind is permanent, is non-compounded. And this is why you can see that his view of reality is much closer to the third turning of the wheel than to the second one.
Is he different from Sherap Gyeltsen and Shakya Chokden in that respect, in holding that the ultimate mind is permanent? Do they?
Dolpopa holds that. Obviously, it's permanent. It's real. It's
permanent name.
It's everything. I forgot Shakya. I think Shakya Choden argues that it's not permanent.
Yeah.
I think so.
It's not as impermanent?
Yeah.
No causes and conditions?
Well, there is some people makes a distinction between in general produced by cause and condition and produced by impure causes and conditions. So this is one other way, for example, to hedge one's bet, right? And to maintain a view of pure mind, which is kind of uncompounded, as we think compound means, but is it really uncompounded? No, because it has it's momentary and so on. So there, as you can see, I'm just sketching for you the range of possible views, and all these views could be said in one way or the other to fall under the rubric Zhentong. So Zhentong, as His Holiness said, using a fairly loaded term, white Zhentong and black Zhentong. we wonder what that means. So you have the Zhentong compatible with the second turning of the wheel, and you have the Zhentong incompatible with the second turning of the wheel, like Dolpopa would be incompatible, clearly, very explicitly. For Dolpopa, the second turning of the wheel is just a preparation for the third one.
You've spoken about people who, let's see, who were other than Sherap Gyeltsen, who was prior to Tsongkhapa, who made a difference between Yogācāra and Chittamatra? Do you know?
No, I don't know. My expectation is that it's a fairly widespread difference.
Yeah, and it's just that none of the commentaries where Tsongkhapa explicitly makes the difference attribute any name.
Yeah.
Whereas they attribute names all over the place to others, to other opinions.
I don't think it's a very.
Oh, it's so widespread, or.
Yeah, my sense is that it must have been fairly widespread. One place, for example, one could look is Mati, Mati Pension. Commentary, what's that, on the Abhidhamma Samachaya, or something like that? Yeah, that would be one way to look at. Because my sense is that it's not at all, I mean, it is clear that Tsongkhapa is making a very precise point when he identifies the two, right? And that goes together with claiming that the third turning of the wheel, making the separation between the other sutras, Tathagata Sutra and so on, and the Sandhya-Vimochana. I think this has nothing to do with each other. They're completely separate, and the Sandhya-Vimochana is a Chittamatra Sutra, which is also what Yogācāra means. Now, this is obviously a very important move. This is why Lekshen Rinpo is the key text of Tsongkhapa, because it expresses all his hermeneutical approach, all his where does he stand when he when he gives his interpretation on the second turning of the wheel, 100%. And therefore, everything which threatens that interpretation has to be dealt in various ways. And one way of dealing with it is to say that Sandhya-Vimochana is Yogācāra, is a Chittamatra text, and Yogācāra and Chittamatra means the same. What do you do then with the Tathagata Sutra? Well, you cut them off from the Sandhya-Vimochana and say, this is different. And it's not entirely false, because the Sandhya-Vimochana Sutra and the Tathagata Sutra are clearly different sutras, and they have all different views on the nature of the mind. Nevertheless, it is also clear that there is a much greater similarity than is reflected by Tsongkhapa doxographical categories. But this is why Lekshen Rinpo is such an important text, because it's only by making this kind of move that the Gelugpa view can be defended, because then you have way to deal with all these views based on the third turning of the wheel. And you can say, well, third turning of the wheel, let's make a difference. We have Sandhya-Vimochana on one side, then we have all the other sutras, and these basically deal with the practice of bodhisattva and so on. They are not really relevant to the view of ultimate reality. So this is why, let me also remind you that it's not just Tsongkhapa who makes this kind of move. Shakya Pandita makes a similar move and so on. So it's not a Gelug versus non-Gelug, as it comes down nowadays. Because nowadays, basically, Shakya, Kagyu, Gelug, Shakya, Kagyu, Nyingma share the same view. They all come out of the Rime movement. They all study with the same people. They all study the same text and so on. Very unsurprisingly, they basically have the same views with small differences and so on. But this is what nowadays Shakya, for example, hold doesn't completely reflect what was what's in Shakya Pandita and so on. I mean, there has been a long evolution as for every school, right?
I'm not clear on who, like after Tsongkhapa's time, it seems like everybody you've mentioned came after Tsongkhapa in terms of clarifying the distinction between Chittamatra and Yogacara.
Yeah.
So during Tsongkhapa's life, was there any proponent of Zhentong who was making a distinction between Chittamatra and Yogacara?
As I said to Jeffrey, my sense is that this distinction is a widespread distinction. Yogacara, Chittamatra in Tibet, it's a fairly widespread distinction. It's clear that not everybody made that distinction. I don't remember, for example, the Losel Dukta, for example. I don't think there is a distinction. I don't think so. He was a Kadampa, right? But for example, I would think that you would find that distinction in Sansan Matipenchen and so on, where this distinction probably already exists. And then obviously you had the Zhentong, right? Dolpopa and his followers.
But did they make that distinction?
I'm not familiar with Dolpopa's work. My expectation is that they would, but I'm not familiar with his work. It's a fairly widespread distinction. It's not what is remarkable in one way is Tsongkhapa not making it, but it's not Tsongkhapa alone, because presumably other people make it. I think it's very important in understanding Tibetan Buddhism not to be too caught by this label Shakya, Gelug, Nyingma, because they're pretty, they are very meaningful and. But the meaning is not what they seem to be. I mean, they are politically very meaningful and very important, but as far as the actual view of things, they are hydrants more than anything else. Because if you actually look at the genealogies in Tibetan Buddhism, they don't recover that of the lineage. It's only in the last maybe 2 centuries that there is this kind of radical polarization. And so it's very important to not just to think in terms of Tsongkhapa versus everybody else, but in terms of the field that Tsongkhapa was addressing. And there were already differences there, I assume. And so presumably some people made that difference and some people didn't make that difference between Yogacara and Chittamatra. I would expect it to be found in a place like Satsang Matipenchen, for example.
I didn't mention in George's introduction perhaps the greatest glory, which is that he spent some 12 years in India studying and ultimately received a Geshe degree. He wanted to receive it without being associated with a particular monastery. So the Dalai Lama, I suppose you would say suggested, but
yes.
It's whatever, that he sit for the degree at all of the beautiful monasteries. And it's only someone both with George's mind and who had gone through such training who could then branch out and get a hold of all this stuff without being drowned in a sea of confusion. So
it takes a little while.
So, please don't hold back. I'm sure George wouldn't want you to hold back
Yeah, go ahead.
any more than he wanted the people in these various monasteries testing him to hold back.
would non-Gelugpa scholars after Tsongkhapa, would they argue? Do they have specific arguments against his limiting the Yogacara view to the Samdhinirmochana Sutra?
I haven't seen any like that. No, I haven't seen. In fact, the text I have seen don't deal with this question at great length. I guess what they're arguing for is, the main point they're arguing for is the following, is that Maitriya's texts reflect a view of reality which is not capturable either by prasangika, or second turning of the wheel, or the idea of Chittamatra. That's what they really insist very strongly on. One of the arguments, for example, which I find extremely convincing personally, is that it's a bit crazy to chop out Maitriya's text into one is prasangika, and the other is so and so, and they're all kind of all over the place and so on. And they basically say, look, don't this text all have something in common? They might have some small differences, but they basically reflect a coherent view of reality, a view in which ultimate reality is seen as mind, right? As related to mind, pertaining to mind. And this is what they very strongly insist on, that this is a bona fide view of reality is in this Maitreya text, and it's not just mind only. So this is where they spend a lot of time working on. And this is what Shakya Choden calls Madhyamika of experience. Madhyamika elaborates.
What's the Tibetan for that?
Forgot, I think, is Nyamnyo, Umapat, Rigpa, I think it's Wantu Chepa, but I could be wrong. It's Nyamnyo and Rigpa.
We end up talking too much in English.
So this is where really, I haven't seen any of these texts dealing in great deal with Samdhinirmochana Sutra and so on. Go ahead.
Okay, in the lecture in Nibo, in the very beginning, Paramappa Samagata is restating what the Buddha had said about the phenomena that the three natures can be applied to. He says from form all the way through to omniscient knowledge of all aspects.
Mm-hmm.
So one can take that then to say that one can look at, say, Rigpa, and apply the three natures to that. But in the lecture Nimbo, what kind of we got walked through is form. The three reasonings that a Sangha uses, and then the examinations are based on examining a form because it's the simplest. But I was wondering if you could possibly walk us through how that would apply to an awareness like Rigpa, or
Rigpa here is not on the table.
Even in general.
Remember that what I said is, I made it very, very vague. I said a view of ultimate reality relating to mind. Now, Rigpa, as you mean Dzogchen, means something very, very specific, which is not on the table, right?
Yeah.
It's just what I wanted to show is that, for example, Rigpa is just one example of a view of ultimate reality, which is different from the second turning of the wheel because it involves mind, right?
Yeah.
It's not just mere absence, but it's absence qualifying a certain aspect of mind, right? So I think that you find in the Yogacara literature.
Yeah.
You don't find anything called Rigpa. I mean, this is a different question,
That was
right?
a slip-up. That was my own overlay. But even if you start with, say, the self-awareness that's referred to in Satrantika, in the same way that one moves through examining a form, and from the Satrantika system and the Dunchi, the meaning generality of that form, In the same way, how would you move from the self-awareness presented in Sautrantika through how it may be more subtly presented in Chittamatra by looking at the three natures?
I'm not sure I understand completely your question. Starting with form is just this aspect. How many there are? 120? Okay, 108 are just standard categories that you find throughout the minor scriptures, right? So starting with form is just to indicate that you can apply basically the same to any of these categories, which are found there. Now, as far as I'm not sure, self-cognition is a different question, right?
Yeah.
Now, in fact, self-cognition is a very interesting notion because the people who argue for a view of ultimate reality based on the third turning of the will often use self-cognition as relating to the understanding of ultimate reality, because in fact what they view is basically the clear mind is ultimate reality, and the clear mind and self-cognition in one way is nothing but the mind as it is aware of itself, right, in its clarity.
Yeah.
And so there is a use of the word, of the notion of self-cognition to support the view of ultimate reality. That you find in Shakya Choden, in several others.
What is the invitational nature of self-awareness?
But self-awareness, if you notice, is not among these 108.
It doesn't count as one of the form too?
No.
Oh.
No, in fact, no.
No, it's not a verbal aspect. So that's completely outside of, so then in the Lecce Ningbo, any type of awareness is completely outside of what's described in the three natures?
No, not at all. Now, be careful that here we're mixing things. For Tsongkhapa, self-awareness is clearly Paratantra, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, I don't like to use the word of self-awareness in relation to Lecce Ningbo, because this is an explanation of a Sangha tradition. Now, as you probably know, self-awareness is nowhere to be found in a Sangha's text. So I think it's illegitimate to use the term of self-awareness in relation to a Sangha's form, because it's not there. Now, obviously, you can beat the text and say, well, what would he have said? Well, the fact is, he didn't say anything. And I think this is an exercise, by the way, that people do in the monastery. What's a Sangha's view on self-awareness? And then they start to debate like that. But I think, in fact, it's one shouldn't do that and not talk about the term unless it's there, either explicitly or at least implicitly in something which is more than, well, it has to be there, right? So now for Tsongkhapa, if you wanted to push it and say, well, where's self-awareness is Paratantra. For Tsongkhapa, if you pushed it and say, well, where does it fit in the three nature? Well, it clearly fits in Paratantra. But remember that Tsongkhapa's view is Parinishpana, and the view that these other thinkers have of Parinishpana is different. Because these other thinkers think that mind itself, that mind in its purity, non-dual mind, is Parinishpana.
But by saying that it's Paratantra, then that assumes that one's perception of it is overlaid with the invitational nature, and then it's where does one find the analysis of what that is, exactly what that overlay is. You find what it is, the overlay is for form in the Sangha's three reasonings.
Yeah. Well, you know that I really am quite.
It's the same.
It's the same.
But there is a question.
The invitational nature will be the same.
There is a question of this.
say how they do.
Yeah, yeah.
You know,
Bet you could
if
scale
you're
it.
looking for something different.
More detail than that, I guess.
Yeah, what you're looking for is a Gelugpa text that gives you more detail on the meditation.
Yeah.
It has to be divine from these theoretical texts. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Is self-awareness, is that introduced by Dignaga, Dharmakirti, or is
Yeah, Dignaga, Dharmakirti, Rajik, right? That's a key term, and these thinkers of the second group use it to push forward their view because they identify Rajik as having soteriological importance, right? I mean, Rajik is kind of close to what they mean by ultimate reality. Now, be careful also that their understanding of Rajik and the Gelug understanding of Rajik is different. So this is not an easy map to draw because they have a different understanding. And it all comes down to their different understanding of Akara. Because the understanding of Akara that I give you, by the way, is not the Gelug understanding of Akara. So all this is rather intricate and complex.
There's this category that some Chinese scholars propose as emptiness school and existence school. I just wonder whether you have heard of that two categories.
No, but it's just one way to cast that difference. I think there are many ways to spell out that differences, because not all. For example, Mipham, for example, has a view of ultimate reality, which he would strenuously argue is not a view based on existence. It's a Madhyamika view, right? So it's not based on existence, and yet it is based on the third turning of the wheel. But there is a distinction, very clear between the second and the third turning of the wheel. Now, whether how you cast that difference is going to change, right?
Yeah, or I just wonder whether there's a Chinese classification and the Tibetans didn't quite do it that way.
Well, the Tibetans just talk about the two turnings of the wheel. It's clear that when you look at Chinese Buddhists, you can see that almost every school rests on the third turning of the wheel, right? Very, very few. I mean, the second turning of the wheel plays a role rather minor, right? And almost all the Chinese school, in one way or another, rest on the third turning of the wheel. In Tibet, the situation is a bit different.
George, among the scholars who present the ultimate mind as, or present mind as ultimate, how do they avoid the problem of solipsism? I mean, how do they assert the existence of other minds? I mean, it seems like they're positing one universal mind.
No, not at all. They're positing, well, how they avoid the problem of solipsism is one question. Positing one universal mind or not is another question. These are two different questions. For people like Shakya Choden and so on, ultimate mind, ultimate mind is not one big thing, right? But it's clear that it's beyond any categories. And therefore, it doesn't make much sense to talk about my mind, my kind of ta-ta-ta and your ta-ta-ta and so on, because they're all not one, but there is no, it's neither one nor different. Now, mind, where the difference comes is obviously at the conventional level, but that doesn't make them really holding that there is a kind of one big mind in which we all share, right? It's just their view that because it's, when mind is seen ultimately, it's neither one nor different, right? Now, as far as how do you avoid solipsism, well, that's, I guess they will all go back to Dharmakirti's text, establishment of others continuum, and just say, make the kind of inference that you find in Western philosophy. How do you infer others' people's mind? Well, you infer from the kind of relation that you see between external behavior and your own and your own mind, and then you make the same your same inference in relation to others, and whether others, whether there is external matter or not, doesn't change anything, right? That's the argument.
Does anybody bring up the problem of dreams? Because in dreams we see somebody else moving, and we impute motivation to it, and it's mistaken, however. So is there any dealing with that?
Well, I mean, same as between, I mean, we see a table and when we see a table in dream, right?
Yes.
So if we can make a difference between a table in reality and a table in dream, we can also make...
If we can.
Yeah, if we can.
I'm wondering how, that's sort of the floor, that there is a difference between dream and so-called reality, is the floor is a presupposition.
No, I don't think it's a presupposition, but I think it's basically going to come down to the fact that, well, we all wake up in the same reality, right? So...
so do my friends in the dreams.
No, they don't.
They sure look like it.
Exactly.
There's something,
Yeah, I know.
oh, like a motivation that must be another person.
Mind you, I think there are even worse problems, because I don't think it's possible to talk about other people's mind unless they have a body.
Unless they have a what?
A body.
Mm.
I mean, there is no way you can imagine another person's mind without any body, right? So I think the idea...
Without any what?
Body.
Body.
So I think the argument is completely flawed for me, because it just doesn't work, because you need a body to be able to talk about the mind, right?
Oh, come on.
How can you identify another person's mind?
I just wanted to, just to touch at the beginning how we might go.
So I think the argument for me doesn't go very far, but I haven't seen anything. I don't think there's anything special to. I mean, it's just the problem of any kind of Yogacara, Chittamatra view, right? And the question of how much this is idealism, how much this is not idealism, and so on. That's a different question.
What kind of, European, American, etc., types of idealism or mentalism do, either the Chittamatra Yogācāra equivalent fit into, or Chittamatra and Yogācāra?
Well,
that's different.
Yeah, I think they're all different. I think Berkeley is the closest.
Closest to what?
Yeah, to Yogācāra, to Chittamatra.
Living out the...
Yeah, living out the... I think Berkeley is the best. I mean, if you understand Chittamatra to say that, to talk about matter, right, to deny matter, I think it's clearly very, very close. It really resembles Berkeley quite closely.
So is this what they call pure mind, non-dual, pure mind? Is it aware of itself? And how?
Yes.
But how can it be this non-dual if it's...
Precisely, that's what Randik is about, right?
Right. How can a mind be aware of itself completely? How is that possible to be self-aware?
Completely is a different question. It's just aware of its own knowing quality. Well, that's the question of Randik, right? How can you have a mind which is...
Yeah, right.
Now, in normal perception, it's a bit easier to explain. If I take the Shakya Choden Kurampa view, because usually when we perceive a phenomenon, right, we have a representation, an akara. Now, Randik is just a perception of that representation. That's what Randik means in
the representation of itself.
No. In normal cases.
Oh, okay.
Okay? The mind is aware of itself just means that the mind perceives representations. Representations which are part of the mind, right?
Right.
So, Okay?
So it's just like any other object.
Well, it's not like any other object, no, because you have to remember, we're not talking about external object, we're talking about an internal object, right? Some kind of representation, which is, this is very similar, by the way, to Locke and many Western representationalists, right, who argue that we don't see the object directly, all what we see are internal representation of this external object, right? Now, Zhangrik self-cognition is just the awareness of this internal object. So, in general, now among Shakya, for example, between Karmapa, Shakya Choden, and other Shakyas, there is a dispute to know whether Zhangrik has an object or not. Karmapa say, yes, there is an object. They're not separate, but it's an object, otherwise couldn't be a subject, and so on. Karmapa say, no, not at all, it's not an object. If it's an object, it would be different. It's not, therefore it's not an object. Now, the situation gets a little bit more difficult to explain when you don't have any akara, right? That is in case of pure mind being aware of itself, right? Well, there, what is going well? Just that, right? Just mind in its pure knowing quality.
Knowing itself.
Knowing itself. Because there, at that point, there is no representation. Right? Representation intervenes only in case of external perception. Right?
How did you said briefly that Dignaga and the Gelug understanding of representation was different?
Well, that's another. I said the Shakya and the Gelug understanding of representation is different. Of representation, no, of Akara, of Nampa. Because for the Gelug, the Nampa is not a representation, but is the consciousness.
So what are you translating as, when you say representation?
No, I'm not translating.
Okay.
I am characterizing. It's not a translation of Akara.
Okay.
Akara is translated as aspect.
Okay.
And Gelug and Shakya have a different view of what that means. For the Gelug, we perceive the external world directly. What's the aspect? It's just a consciousness which arises as having the mark of the external object. The Shakya say, no, not at all. You don't understand at all what Dharmakirti and Dignaga mean. By Akara, Akara is not the consciousness, is the representation of the external object, which is part of consciousness. So in the Shakya analysis, you have three terms, right? You have the object, the representation, the Akara, and then the grasping of it, Akara. Right? For the Gelug, not at all. You have the object and then you have consciousness. So you have, perception is a two-term, is to be explained through a two-term relation, whereas for the Shakya it's to be explained for a three-term relation.
So would it, in Gelug, would the Akara be considered an attribute of the consciousness?
Its consciousness is as much as it perceives an external object. Which then brings the question, what do you do with self-cognition? Which is why the Gelug are so keen to get rid of self-cognition when they move to Madhyamika, because it does nothing for them. I mean, it's just supplementary, right? When you have a kind of double intentionality, or at least you're threatened with a double intentionality. Hence, when they move to Madhyamika, they say, no, let's get rid of it. Whereas for the Shakya, Karmapa is arguing very strongly, but you should keep Rangrik, because you still need representation and you still have the same analysis of mind when you move to the Madhyamika.
I'm still stuck in this self-aware thing. Could we say for the mind only, basically all you can ever know is your own particular mind, which is dependently arising for Chittamatra?
Yeah, according to which interpretation.
All right.
Yeah, that's very important, right? Because I didn't talk about Chittamatra,
Yeah.
I talked about Tibetan interpretations of Chittamatra.
Right.
So Are you talking about Tsongkhapa's
No, I guess
interpretation?
not.
You
Yeah.
probably not, right?
Probably not.
So you're talking about like Rampa and Shakya Choden and so on.
Yeah. Okay.
So,
For them, then, all you can ever know is your own mind
Yes.
internally arising.
exactly.
And then for the Zhentongpas, all you can ever know is this pure mind,
No, for
or what?
Shantongpa, that's a different, we're stepping outside
Yeah,
a
right.
little bit.
I want to see the difference between self-awareness for Zhentongpa and Chittamatra.
Well, you're right, it's pretty similar. One time I asked Namkhanopu whether Dzogchen held to external, whether Dzogchenpa admitted external object or not. And the answer is, I have never met a Dzogchenpa who argue that there are external objects. Right? So that would lead to me to believe that it's in fact pretty close. Right?
Yeah.
And that the main distinction is about the ontological status of that mind, right?
Right. That
Of the
particular
different
mind,
types of mind.
The different types,
Yeah.
I see.
But you're right, in this picture, what is happening is that we just perceive our mind.
Right.
And that's what Svasamvedana, that's what Ranjik is, right?
Right.
That's right.
It seemed when you were talking about the difference between the two wheels, the second and the third wheels, that you were positing that the third wheel, mind, is a final doctrine, rather than an emptiness of the invitational nature.
Yeah. I was actually quite vague, if you remember.
Yeah.
So in order to accommodate a variety of views.
I see. So,
Now remember that the emptiness of imputational nature is supposed to come to the same than the emptiness of duality, right? Now, that's actually what I was talking about, is really this emptiness of duality, but not understood as a mere emptiness, but understood as qualifying mind itself, which you even find in some Gelug scholars. I forgot who has a view
I've
of
got two.
what?
I think Peter Rumche has something like that.
Yeah,
And Janya.
Oh, Champa, that's one. Of emptiness in Yogacara being a mainga, being an implicative negation, right? So you find that even in some Gelugpa. So that's what I was talking about.
So turning to the Gelugpa view of thoroughly established nature, the wisdom is the mind perceiving emptiness.
You mean in the Chittamatra system?
No, I guess how Dzongpa characterizes the Chittamatra system. I'm trying to figure out how there is not a difference between subject and object when you have a mind perceiving emptiness. How?
Oh, because it's all emptiness, right?
Because it's all the mind.
No, it is its own emptiness.
What the mind is its own emptiness.
The mind perceives its own emptiness.
The mind perceives its own emptiness.
So it's not like something external to it. That's in fact.
But that's still a mind, an object, subject perceiving its own emptiness, an object.
Well, I mean, if you want to say conventionally, there is a distinction for in the Gelug. But remember that, for example, Shakya Choden and Karamba would argue whether this, you can say it's an object or subject, or whether these terms don't apply. So obviously Tsongkhapa would say that it is an object and it is a subject, but it's not, they're not separate, right? The distinction is purely nominal.
Okay, right.
It's not two things, right? It's just different ways of describing the same thing. Right?
Yeah, that makes
The word thing hardly applies to emptiness.
Well, it's been most stimulating.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And I want to say also provocative, but provocative would suggest disagreement. I haven't found it's stimulating, but so stimulating that it's provocative, if you know what I mean. Opening up all sorts of areas, which is exactly what we want. So thank you so much for doing this.
Well, thank you. It was fun.